Political assassinations, civil war close calls, criminal politicians, a Prime Minister that disappeared, and a sitting Member of Parliament that is admitted to aching the Beatles. Australian politics is something else, and if you want to find out the lore behind all these stories and so much more, you'll have to stay tuned. As we are coming into election season, this is the perfect video for first-time voters, voters wishing to brush up on Auspol knowledge, people moving to Australia that wish to acquaint themselves with our political system, or simply anybody that wants to learn something new. If you are unaware as to what an iceberg chart explanation video is, iceberg charts derive from the term just the tip of the iceberg, the tip referring to the most well-known knowledge regarding, in our case, Australian politics. Each tier gets more and more obscure, with the bottom tiers being very obscure and or dark events in the history of Australian politics. Join me as we go down the Australian political iceberg. Tier 1. The two-party system. Australia's political landscape is dominated by a two-party system, with the Australian Labor Party, known as the ALP, and the Liberal National Coalition, known as the Coalition, alternating in power for most of the country's history. The ALP generally favours left-leaning policies, typically in favour of workers' rights, trade unions and social democracy, while the Coalition advocates for right-leaning policies, typically in favour of businesses, farmers and free market economics. Parliament. Parliament is where Australia's elected representatives meet to create and pass laws, and comprises two chambers, the House of Representatives, Green, and the Senate, Red. Parliament has met in Parliament House since 1988, and beforehand they met in Old Parliament House, located on the other side of Federation Mall since 1927, and before that they met in the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne. The House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is the lower house of the Australian Parliament and is the larger of the two chambers. It comprises 150 representatives, with all electorates electing one member, with most electorates having similar population sizes. The party or coalition that wins a majority or has the backing of the majority of Parliament forms government, with the Prime Minister typically hailing from this chamber. The Senate. The Senate is the upper house of the Australian Parliament. It comprises 76 senators representing all 6 states equally. Currently, each state has a delegation of 12 senators. This ensures that smaller states have a significant voice in national decision-making and are not drowned out by the larger states. The Senate plays a crucial role in reviewing and amending legislation passed by the House of Representatives. Unlike the House, parties or coalitions rarely get majorities, the last one being in 2004, with the governing party or parties requiring cooperation with the Senate to pass their agenda. Since 1974, the two territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, have both had 2 senators each. Half the Senate goes for election every 3 years alongside all 4 territory seats. State senators generally serve 6-year terms and territory senators generally serve 3-year terms. Canberra. Canberra is Australia's capital and houses Parliament House, the High Court, the Lodge where the Prime Minister lives, Yarralumla where the Governor-General lives, and a quarter of its population is employed by the public service. It was established in 1913 and declared the capital in 1927. It was designed by Walter Burley Griffin after he won a worldwide contest to design Australia's new capital. The Coalition. The Liberal National Coalition is the major centre-right political bloc in Australia. It's an alliance of two parties, the Liberal Party, focusing mainly on economic liberalism and to a lesser extent social conservatism, and the National Party, primarily representing rural and regional interests, tailored towards the needs of farmers, with a greater emphasis on social conservatism. The Coalition's ideology generally leans towards the right wing of the political spectrum, advocating for free market principles, individual responsibility, strong national defence, and cooperation with the United States. The Prime Minister. The Prime Minister of Australia is the head of the federal government, leading the executive branch and chairing cabinet to set national policy. Appointed by the Governor-General, they're the leader of the majority party or coalition in the House of Representatives. Responsibilities include representing Australia internationally and overseeing key decisions on defence, economy and legislation. Though not detailed in the Constitution, the role has evolved through convention, wielding significant influence over Parliament and public life. Australia's current Prime Minister is Anthony Albanese, in office since May 2022, and our first Prime Minister was Edmund Barton from 1901 to 1903. The longest serving Prime Minister was Robert Menzies, who served for over 18 years, and the shortest serving was Frank Ford, who served for just 7 days in 1945. As a caretaker between John Curtin and Ben Chifley. Official flags. Australia has 3 official flags. The national flag, the Aboriginal flag, representing Aboriginal Australians, and the Torres Strait Islander flag, representing Torres Strait Islanders. They are displayed on all government buildings and at the time of recording all ministerial press conferences. The King of Australia. The King of Australia, currently King Charles III, is the nation's constitutional monarch and head of state. His role is largely ceremonial and symbolic, with powers exercised through the Governor-General, whom he appoints on the Prime Minister's advice. These include assenting to laws, dissolving Parliament, and commanding the armed forces, though always following ministerial guidance. Defined by the Constitution and Convention, the monarch has no day-to-day political involvement residing in the UK. It is important to state that the Australian Crown is a completely separate legal entity to the British Crown or the Canadian Crown. Australia Day. Australia Day, celebrated annually on the 26th of January, marks the arrival of the first fleet of British ships in Sydney Cove in 1788, signifying the beginning of European colonisation. Observed with public holidays, fireworks, and citizenship ceremonies, it's a time for national reflection and celebration. However, in recent years, it has come under fire from some on the left for allegedly being a day of displacement, arguing either to change the day or to abolish the day altogether. Federation. Australia's federation on the 1st of January 1901 united 6 British colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania, into a single nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. This marked a significant turning point in Australian history, establishing a federal system of government with shared powers between the national and state levels. There were calls to include New Zealand and Fiji in this federation, but obviously that did not happen. State premiers. State premiers are the heads of government in each Australian state. They lead their respective state governments, responsible for areas like healthcare, education, transport and law and order within their state. Premiers play a crucial role in advocating for their state's interests within the Australian Federation and working with the federal government on matters of national significance. The territorial equivalent is Chief Minister, having roughly the same responsibilities, although the Australian Capital Territory's Chief Minister also acts as the Mayor of Canberra, as the ACT government is also the Canberra's local government. States and territories. Australia comprises 6 states: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania, as well as 2 internal self-governing territories, the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory. State governments have autonomy, whilst territories do not. Any and all laws passed by territorial governments may be overwritten by the federal parliament, with the most famous instance of this being when the Northern Territory passed the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act 1995, legalising euthanasia in the Northern Territory, one of the first places in the world to do so actually, before it was overwritten by the Euthanasia Laws Act 1997 passed by the Howard government, prohibiting euthanasia legalisation in the territories. The Constitution. The Australian Constitution is the supreme law of Australia, establishing the framework for its governance. It is divided into 8 chapters: Parliament, the Executive, the Judicature, Finance and Trade, the States, New States, Miscellaneous and Alteration of the Constitution. The Constitution can only be amended by a referendum, and it has been amended 8 times throughout Australia's history. Fun fact, when the Constitution was being drafted, it was not guaranteed that Western Australia would be a part of the new Commonwealth, so Western Australia is not included in the preamble. Preferential voting. Australia uses preferential voting, otherwise known as ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, where voters rank candidates in order of preference. If no candidate receives an absolute majority of first preference votes, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated and their votes are redistributed according to their second preferences marked on their ballots. This process continues until a candidate secures an absolute majority, ensuring the elected candidate has majority support. Unlike in first-past-the-post systems, the candidate that wins the plurality of the vote does not necessarily automatically win the election. Compulsory voting. Australia has compulsory voting, meaning all eligible citizens are legally required to show up to vote in federal elections. Failure to vote without a valid excuse can result in a fine. Australia's voter turnout is generally around 90%. However, people across the political spectrum agree, including myself, that although compulsory voting should force all Australians to research political parties, candidates and policies, Australians are not well informed in the political sphere. There is no system in place to make sure someone actually filled out the ballot or not, considering voting is secret. In fact, the secret ballot is also known as the Australian ballot, as Australia was the first place in the world to introduce secret ballots. A voter is only supervised picking up a ballot paper or papers and putting them into the ballot box or boxes. The High Court. The High Court of Australia is the nation's highest judicial body, established under the Australian Constitution. It serves as the final court of appeal, resolving disputes in civil and criminal cases, and interprets the Constitution to ensure laws align with it. Comprising 7 justices, including a Chief Justice, the court sits in Canberra. Its key roles include safeguarding the Constitution, settling federal and state disputes, and upholding the rule of law. Tier 2. The Disappearance of Harold Holt. On the 17th of December 1967, Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt disappeared while swimming in rough seas near Portsea, Victoria. Despite a massive search effort, his body was never recovered. While accidental drowning is the accepted explanation, various conspiracy theories have emerged over the years. Claims that he was a Chinese spy and a submarine collected him. This remains the only time a world leader has simply disappeared without a trace and without a resolution. The Scott Morrison Engadine McDonald's incident. It is said that on the night of the 20th of September 1997, after former Prime Minister Scott Morrison's favourite rugby league team, the Cronulla Sharks, lost the 1997 Super League Grand Final, he went to the Engadine McDonald's, a suburb in southeastern Sydney, and shit himself in anger. This is commemorated with a bronze statue outside the Engadine McDonald's. This, unfortunately, is not a true story. The creator of this rumour, Roman Dix, revealed in 2023 that he made it up as a joke and did not intend for it to become an urban legend. Scott Morrison in Hawaii. Another Scott Morrison entry. During the 2019-2020 bushfires, our worst bushfire season ever, when Australia was constantly in the international news, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison decided it would be a good idea to sneak off to Hawaii for a holiday. This was a secret as well. He didn't tell the public. He knew that this was the wrong thing to do, yet he did it anyway. Worst of all, he let his wife Jenny take the fall for it. We only found out about it because of a photo an Australian tourist took with him. Tony Abbott, regardless of your thoughts on him, selflessly and honourably volunteered as a firefighter, risking his life for others. Kevin Rudd, during the 2011 Brisbane floods, waded knee-high water and got a foot infection just to help people move out their belongings from their flooded houses. Scott Morrison ought to hang himself. Scott Morrison ought to hang his head in shame. The misogyny speech. The misogyny speech was delivered by Prime Minister Julia Gillard in 2012 during parliamentary debate. In it, she condemned the opposition leader Tony Abbott for his comments she interpreted as
as misogynistic and behaviour towards women in politics. The speech was a highly publicised event, sparking national and international debate about sexism and gender equality in politics. It is considered a landmark moment in Australian political history, even inspiring Hillary Clinton. The dismissal. The dismissal of Gough Whitlam in 1975 by the Governor-General remains the only time a Governor-General has dismissed the Prime Minister within Commonwealth realms. This crisis stemmed from a deadlock between the Whitlam Labor government and the opposition-controlled Senate over the government's budget bills. The Senate, under the leadership of Malcolm Fraser, repeatedly blocked supply, refusing to pass the necessary legislation to fund government operations. Governor-General Sir John Kerr, appointed by the Whitlam government, intervened in this constitutional convention. He dismissed Whitlam and his government, citing the government's inability to secure supply as the justification. Kerr then appointed Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister, who immediately advised the Governor-General to dissolve both houses of Parliament and call an early election. This unprecedented action sparked widespread protests and ignited a fierce debate about the balance of power between the government and the Senate, the role of the Governor-General, and the very nature of Australian democracy. There have been many theories of British royal and American intelligence interference, as the Whitlam government was hostile to American influence in Australia and once had all ASIO offices raided and demanded a list of all CIA operatives in Australia. The Liberal National Coalition, led by Fraser, won the subsequent election, excluding the Labor Party from power for another 8 years. The win was so big that for Labor, it was the lowest seat percentage for a major party in Australian history and was one of the few times the Liberals had won enough seats to not require a coalition with the National Party. But in all of those circumstances, they kept the coalition intact. I recommend this video by History Matters about the 1975 constitutional crisis. Cabinet. The Cabinet of Australia is the executive of the Australian government, comprising the Prime Minister and all government ministers. It's responsible for developing and implementing government policy, making crucial decisions on national issues, overseeing government departments, and advising the Prime Minister on key matters of state. Prime Minister chairs Cabinet and comprises members of both houses of Parliament and is elected by the party caucus, requiring cooperation between different factions to please all party members. Julian Assange. Julian Assange, a journalist from Townsville, Queensland, is an Australian publisher and activist known for founding WikiLeaks, a non-profit organisation that specialises in the anonymous publication of private, secret and classified material, usually from whistleblowers. In 2010, WikiLeaks gained international notoriety when it published a series of leaks provided by Chelsea Manning documenting war crimes committed by the United States Army and covered up by the Deep State, including the collateral murder video depicting a US Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad and hundreds of thousands of classified US military documents from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. These publications sparked global debate about government transparency, freedom of the press, and the ethics of publishing classified information. Following the publication of these leaks, Assange faced legal troubles in the United States. He sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for 7 years before being arrested in 2019. In 2024, he pleaded guilty to one count of conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defense information in a court in Saipan, the Northern Mariana Islands, the closest court under US jurisdictions to the Commonwealth of Australia. This plea deal resulted in his release from prison and his return to Australia, returning to Canberra on the 26th of June 2024. Teal Independents. The Teal Independents are a group of centrist independent politicians who emerged as a significant force in the 2022 election. They chose the colour teal as it was between blue and green. Blue from the economic liberalism shared in support with the Liberal Party, and green from the social liberalism, climate action and grassroots democracy shared in support with the Greens. The Teal Independents gained significant support, particularly in affluent urban and suburban electorates, mainly disaffected Liberal voters. Many received financial backing from Climate 200, a political action group dedicated to climate change action. Teal Independents won 8 seats at the 2022 federal election, demonstrating a shift in voter preferences towards independent candidates and highlighting the importance of climate change as a key electoral issue. However, the close nature of many Teal Independents has led some commentators and politicians to refer to them as a quasi-political party. Republic versus Monarchy. The Republican debate in Australia centres on whether or not the country should transition from a constitutional monarchy, currently in personal union with the United Kingdom and 13 other Commonwealth realms, to a republic where an Australian would serve in that role. Republicanism has been debated for decades, reaching its apex in 1999, where in a referendum, Australians voted on whether to become a republic with a president appointed by a two-thirds majority of the parliament. The referendum failed, with 54.87% of voters opting to retain the monarchy. There is debate among Republicans as to whether a presidential republic similar to France or the United States, or a parliamentary republic similar to Australia's current system but replacing the King and Governor General with a ceremonial president. There is also debate among monarchists, albeit far smaller, as to whether Australia should remain in personal union with the United Kingdom or have an independent monarch. The apology. In 2008, the Australian Parliament issued a formal apology to Indigenous Australians for historical injustices. This landmark apology, delivered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, specifically addressed the stolen generations, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcibly removed from their families. I must remark that there is debate as to whether or not Indigenous children were removed simply for having Indigenous parents, as there were many children who were removed for sexual abuse by their parents. The apology aimed to foster reconciliation and healing between white Australians and Aborigines, recognising the impact of past wrongs on Indigenous communities. Hung Parliament. A hung parliament, which derives its name from hung jury, is where no party manages to win a
majority of seats in the House of Representatives. This will require both major parties to talk with minor parties to either form a coalition or more likely to reach a confidence and supply agreement, forcing the party that forms government to give concessions to the minor parties that help them form government. The first three parliaments were all hung parliaments until the free trade and protectionist parties merged, which is a very strange fact considering that juxtaposition. Since the establishment of the two-party system, Australia has only had two hung parliaments, 1940 and 2010. Minor parties. As stated previously, Australia has minor parties. The major minor parties have changed over time, but the two main ones right now are the Greens and One Nation. All the minor parties in Parliament right now, including the Greens and One Nation, are the United Australia Party, the Jackie Lambie Network, the Centre Alliance, the Katters Australian Party, Australia's Voice, and the People First Party. Historical major minor parties include the Democratic Labour Party and the Australian Democrats. Levels of government. Australia has three levels of government: local, state and territory, and federal. The federal government, based in Canberra, handles national matters like defence, immigration and trade. The states and territories manage regional affairs such as education, health and transport, with their own parliaments and laws. Local governments such as city or shire councils oversee community services including refuse collection, parks maintenance and local roads. The crossbench. The crossbench refers to members of parliament who sit neither with the government nor the opposition in the House of Representatives or the Senate. These are either independents or representatives of minor parties like the Greens or One Nation. They can influence legislation mainly in the Senate, but especially in hung parliaments where no party has a clear majority. The crossbench plays a key role in negotiations, often holding the balance of power, and brings diverse perspectives to debates, reflecting a broader range of voter interests. Corruption. Corruption in Australia, while relatively low globally, regrettably still occurs across the three levels of government. Australia has unfortunately fallen from 7th in the global corruption rankings in 2012 to its low of 18th a decade later, climbing back up to 10th thanks to the creation of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. Famous examples of corruption in Australian history include Eddie O'Beirne, a New South Wales minister who was jailed for rigging coal licences to enrich his family during the 2010s. Queensland Premier Joh Bjelke-Petersen's premiership was marked by police bribery and collapsed after the 1987 Fitzgerald inquiry. Paul Pasali, Mayor of Ipswich, Queensland, was convicted in 2020 for taking bribes and favours following a corruption probe. Former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian resigned in 2021 after ICAC found she had crappily favoured her secret partner's electorate in Wagga Wagga. Indigenous affairs. Indigenous affairs in Australia centre on federal and state efforts to address health, education and economic disparities for Australia's Indigenous peoples. Legislative priorities for Indigenous Australians include improving life outcomes, known as closing the gap, exploring constitutional recognition and reducing incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians. Tier 3. The budget. The Australian budget is an annual financial plan outlining the federal government's revenue and spending for the upcoming fiscal year, typically delivered in May. Prepared by the Treasurer, it covers areas like health, education, defence and infrastructure funded by taxes. It aims to balance economic growth, public services and debt management with surpluses or deficits depending on priorities and global conditions. Referenda. In Australia, referenda are nationwide votes to amend the Constitution. Proposed changes must pass both Houses of Parliament before going to a public vote, requiring a double majority. Approval by a majority of voters nationally and in at least 4 of the 6 states. Since 1901, 45 proposals have been voted on, with only 8 succeeding. The highest yes vote in 1967 regarding the inclusion of Indigenous people in the census. The highest no vote was in 1988 regarding the Rights and Freedoms Amendment. Due to the low success rate, Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, famously stated, "To get an affirmative vote from the Australian people on a referendum proposal is one of the labours of Hercules." Free trade. Free trade, although controversial, is an integral part of Australia's economy, as Australia maintains free trade agreements with many countries and organisations, including New Zealand, the United States, ASEAN, China, Indonesia, India and the United Kingdom. Free trade aims to increase international cooperation and global wealth, as well as decrease prices through cheaper products through offshoring. Think tanks. Political think tanks are party-aligned organisations that research and advocate policy ideas to influence government and public opinion. Many political parties have their own think tanks, including the Menzies Research Centre, aligned with the Liberals, the Chifley Research Centre, aligned with Labour, the Page Research Centre, aligned with the Nationals, and the Green Institute, aligned with the Greens. Prime Minister birthplaces. No surprise, most Prime Ministers were born in Australia, at least 23 to be specific, of which 10 were born in New South Wales, 8 from Victoria, 3 from Queensland, and 1 each from South Australia and Tasmania. 6 were born in the United Kingdom, 3 from England, 2 from Scotland, and 1 from Wales. One Prime Minister, Chris Watson, was born in Chile. John Gorton's birthplace is disputed between Wellington, New Zealand, and Melbourne, Victoria. Prime Minister's electorates. You thought New South Wales and Victoria had a stranglehold on the Prime Ministerial Birthplaces list. 25 of Australia's 31 Prime Ministers have represented either in New South Wales or Victoria. 4 were from Queensland, and 1 each from Western Australia and Tasmania. Australia's last 4 and 8 of the last 12 Prime Ministers were from New South Wales alone. One electorate, Higgins, has been home to multiple Prime Ministers, Holt and Gorton. Leadership spills. Leadership spills are internal party votes to replace a sitting leader, often the Prime Minister or opposition leader, due to dissatisfaction or poor polling. They occur when a challenger calls for a ballot within the parliamentary party, requiring a majority to succeed. Recent spills include Scott Morrison ousting Malcolm Turnbull in 2018, Turnbull ousting Tony Abbott in 2015, Kevin Rudd ousting Julia Gillard in 2013, and Gillard ousting Rudd in 2010. Following a decade of constant leadership spills, both major parties made it harder for leadership spills to occur. Prime Ministerial residences residences. There are 2 official prime ministerial residences in Australia: Kirribilli House in Sydney Harbour and the Lodge in Canberra. Deputy Prime Ministers. The Deputy Prime Minister, Australia's second highest political office, supports and stands in for the Prime Minister when needed. In coalition government, the Nationals leader holds the role as the Nationals are the junior partner, while Labor appoints its own deputy when in power, currently being Richard Marles. Royal Commissions. Royal Commissions are high-level public inquiries established by the federal or state government to investigate significant issues like corruption, disasters or extreme government mismanagement. Appointed by the Governor-General or state governors, they have broad powers to summon witnesses, compel evidence and hold public hearings. Their findings and recommendations, though not legally binding, often lead to policy changes or legal reforms. Prime Minister's Avenue. Prime Minister's Avenue in Ballarat, Victoria features the busts of the first 29 Prime Ministers on Werribee Avenue in the Ballarat Botanic Gardens. Due to the controversial nature of many Prime Ministers, there have been examples of vandalism and even destruction to the busts, with the busts of Paul Keating and Kevin Rudd being removed with an angle grinder in January 2025. The Liberal National Party. The Liberal National Party of Queensland is a major political party formed in 2008 by a merger of the Liberal Party and the National Party in Queensland. It operates as a conservative force, urban and regional interests, and contests both state and federal elections. At the federal level, it aligns with the Liberal National Coalition, with LNP MPs sitting with either the Liberals or the Nationals in Canberra. Known for advocating free market policies, infrastructure development and regional priorities, the LNP has governed Queensland twice, most recently winning the 2024 state election under leader David Crisafulli. FriendlyJordies. FriendlyJordies is the online persona of Jordan Shanks Markovina, an Australian YouTuber, comedian and political commentator known for his satirical takes. Since launching his channel, he's gained over 1 million subscribers and become arguably the most famous face in Auspol content creation, with videos blending lowbrow humour and investigative journalism, often targeting corruption and media failings. A vocal Labour supporter, he's interviewed figures like Kevin Rudd while clashing with politicians like John Barilaro, leading to legal battles and a high-profile arson attack on his home in November 2022, covered by the likes of Most Critical. His works fill a gap for young audiences skeptical of mainstream narratives, of which most is controlled by Murdoch or other oligarchs accused of favouring the coalition over Labour. Pork barrelling. Pork barrelling in Australia refers to politicians directing public funds to specific regions or projects to gain electoral favour, often prioritising political gain over merit. Common in federal and state budgets, it's seen in grants or infrastructure promises targeting marginal seats. While not always illegal, it's controversial as it distorts fair resource allocation. High-profile cases like the $100 million sports rot scandal before the 2019 election spotlighted the practice when funds skewed towards coalition-held areas. Oversight bodies and public scrutiny aim to curb it. Unfortunately, it remains a persistent tactic. The Brainrot speech. In 2024, Senator Fatima Payman of Western Australia, who had become disillusioned with the Labour Party following her ousting for voting for a motion supporting Palestinian statehood, spoke against a bill prohibiting the use of social media for under-16s using nomenclature that is rightfully considered brainrot.
To the stigmas of Australia, I say that this goofy government have been capping, not just now but for a long time. A few of you may remember when they said there'll be no phantom tax under the government I lead. They're capaholics. They're also yapaholics. They yap non-stop about how their cost of living measures are changing lives for all Australians. Just put the fries in the bag, little bro. They tell us that they're locked in on improving the housing situation in this country. They must have brain rot from watching too much Kai Cenat and forgot about their plans to ban social media for kids under 14. If that becomes law, you can forgo skull emoji all about watching Duke Dennis or catching a dub with the bros on Fort. Chat, is this Prime Minister serious? Even though he's the Prime Minister of Australia, sometimes it feels like he's the CEO of Ohio. I would be taking an L if I did not mention the ops, who want to cut WA's GATS and services tax. The decision voters will be making in a few months' time will be between a mid-government, a dog-water opposition, or a crossbench that will mock both of them. Though some of you cannot yet vote, I hope when you do, it will be in a more go-to Australia for a government with more aura. Skibbity.
It became viral, with it racking up over 5 million views on YouTube and 18 million views on TikTok. Religion of Prime Ministers. Australia as a Christian country will have most of its Prime Ministers being Christian. In fact, only 2 Prime Ministers were not Christian. Bob Hawke and Julia Gillard, both non-theists. Zoom in on the Christian Prime Ministers, we'll see that the vast majority were Protestants, that Catholicism was the most common denomination, while Anglicanism was the most common Protestant denomination. The separation of powers. The separation of powers in Australia divides the government into 3 branches to prevent concentrated authority. The separation of powers in Australia, rooted in the Constitution, divides government into 3 branches to prevent concentrated authority. The legislature, Parliament, makes the laws, comprising the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, implements laws and manages daily governance. The judiciary, the High Court and other courts, interprets laws and ensures their constitutionality, acting independently. This differs from the US as the US Cabinet is independent of Congress, while the Australian Cabinet is comprised of parliamentarians. Scott Morrison's Secret Ministries. The Scott Morrison Secret Ministry saga unfolded in 2022 when it was revealed that the former Prime Minister had secretly appointed himself to 5 additional portfolios: health, finance, resources, treasury, and home affairs between 2020 and 2021. Between 2020 and 2021 during the COVID-19 crisis. These appointments, made via the Governor-General without public or most ministers' knowledge, sparked outrage for undermining transparency and responsible government. Electorates. In Australia, electorates are geographical areas represented by a single member in the House of Representatives, the lower house of the federal government. There are currently 151 electorates, however, due to boundary shifts, that number will go down to 150 at the upcoming election. Redrawn periodically by the Australian Electoral Commission to reflect population shifts. Voters in each electorate
electorate choose their MP during federal elections held every 3 years. The largest is Durack in Western Australia, the smallest is Brainrot in Sydney, the electorate of the Prime Minister, the least populous is Lingiari in the Northern Territory, and the most populous is Longman in Moreton Bay.
Speaking of Longman, I am Malachi Brogden Hearne and I am one of the youngest candidates at this upcoming election, running with Family First in the seat of Longman. If you are an Australian citizen, I ask you to please consider donating to my election fund to help get me on the ballot. This link is in the description and is the top pinned comment, and donations between $2 and $1,500 are tax deductible. For anybody else wishing to help me, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you can get early access to my Substack articles and exclusive Discord benefits. If you do not wish to give me any money for the time being, at least consider liking and subscribing, as well as subscribing to my Substack and joining my free Discord server. This marks the end of part 1. Please consider tuning in next week to see the second and final part of this iceberg. Until then, God bless you all and goodbye.